They say you never forget the moment you realize you're invisible. I remember mine so clearly I can still feel the heat of the sun that day, pressing through the glass like it was trying to burn the truth into my skin. It was the kind of day where silence said more than words ever could, and in my house, silence had a name. It wore tailored suits, spoke with steel in its voice, and smiled only when the numbers on a ledger bowed in reverence. That was my father, Victor Halden. And I was his daughter, the wrong one. I was 6 years old the first time I felt the weight of being second-born, even though I came first. That might not make sense to most people, but in our house, being a girl meant arriving too early in the race. My brother Theo was born 2 years after me, and from the moment he took his first breath, he became the heir, the hope, the golden boy whose very existence rewrote the script of our family story. And I was the rehearsal, the warm-up act nobody remembered. Our home wasn't just a house, it was an empire disguised as a residence. A three-winged manor nestled at the edge of the river valley, designed with angles so sharp they looked like they could cut the sky in half. My grandfather, Gerald Halden, built it himself in the 1950s. He was an engineer, a war veteran, and a man who believed that concrete and sweat were more honest than promises. Every inch of our estate whispered legacy. There were framed patents lining the hallways, polished blueprints under glass in the library, and oil portraits of men who stared down from the walls like gods watching over a bloodline too important to fail. I used to walk those halls quietly, fingertips grazing the lacquered frames, wondering where I fit in the architecture of this legacy. I knew I wasn't meant to ask questions, but I always had them, dozens swirling around in my chest, pressing against my ribs like trapped birds. Why did Theo get a smile for drawing stick figures, while my science fair projects were met with silence? Why did Father's voice soften when Theo entered the room, while it hardened like frozen stone when he spoke to me? And why, when I stayed up 3 nights building a miniature dam out of sugar cubes, string, and a repurposed water bottle, did he call it childish nonsense and toss it in the bin before I even finished explaining the hydro-pressure simulation? I didn't cry. Not then. Not in front of him. I had learned early that tears were currency he refused to exchange. Later that night, I tiptoed into the attic, where the air was thick with the smell of old paper and mothballs, and pulled the pieces of my ruined model from the trash. I sat cross-legged in the dust and began rebuilding it in secret, using glue stolen from my school kit and tape from the kitchen drawer. I didn't know he had followed me. "You have your mother's stubbornness," came a voice from the dark. I nearly dropped the base of the dam as I turned. My grandfather Gerald stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on his cane, his thin frame silhouetted against the attic light like a ghost carved from memory. "Don't stop," he said when I paused. "Keep going." I blinked, heart racing. Father said this was childish," he interrupted. His mouth curled at the corner, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "Your father wouldn't recognize innovation if it danced across a spreadsheet in red ink. Go on. Show me what you've made." I swallowed hard and held up the model, my hands shaking slightly. He came closer, eyes scanning the pieces like they were sacred. Then he reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Its corners were worn, the spine cracked and softened from decades of use. "This was mine when I was your age," he said, placing it in my lap. "Every sketch in here was once a daydream your father told me would never work. Some of them didn't. A few of them changed the world." I stared at the journal, unsure if I was allowed to touch it. "You'll need to fight harder than your brother will," he added softly, almost to himself. "But that doesn't mean you can't win." Those words, "you'll need to fight harder than your brother will," they burrowed into my chest like a seed. They took root that night. I was 8 when I realized the distance between my father and me was not a misunderstanding, but a design. He didn't forget my birthday, he ignored it. He didn't miss my choir performance. He left halfway through to take Theo to a fencing lesson. He didn't say I was less. He didn't have to. The air around us did it for him. I became precise in my rebellion. I studied twice as hard, memorized entire textbooks by flashlight under my blanket when the house fell silent. I stopped asking for praise and started chasing results. I knew every engineering feat in our family's archive by age 10 and could sketch the hydroelectric systems my grandfather designed from memory by 11. Meanwhile, Theo coasted through life like a boy on a parade float, waved at, applauded, never asked to do anything but smile and show up. He wasn't dumb, not exactly, but he didn't have to be anything more than agreeable. His charm worked like oil in Father's machine, slick, smooth, always gliding things forward, even if it never built a damn thing itself. The irony was that Theo liked building things. But he liked building model planes, things with clear instructions and pieces that clicked together predictably. I tried once to teach him something more complex, a hydraulic system using syringes and tubing. He looked at me like I'd handed him a live grenade. "I don't need to know this stuff," he said with a shrug. "I'm not the genius. You are." I froze, unsure if it was an insult or a compliment. Before I could reply, he was gone, already calling for Dad, already being met with a pat on the head and a chuckle. "That's my boy," Dad would say. Never once did he say that about me. When I turned 12, Father brought Theo to a board meeting at Halden Engineering Group. He was 10. They dressed him in a miniature suit and let him sit beside Victor, passing him small graphs to hold like props. I wasn't even told the meeting was happening. I found out because the housekeeper let it slip when I asked where everyone had gone. I watched from the balcony of the mezzanine that overlooked the company's glass conference room. Theo sat swinging his feet, beaming at the executives who clapped at whatever he said, though he couldn't have known what any of it meant. That night, I confronted Father. "You took Theo to the board meeting. He didn't look up from his newspaper. He needs to start learning." I could have learned. I've been reading the quarterly reports since. "You're not ready," he snapped, folding the paper sharply. "And frankly, it's not your role." "What is my role then?" He didn't answer. Just got up and walked away. By 13, I stopped trying to earn space at his table. I started carving my own. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't yet see, was that the empire my grandfather built wasn't just made of steel and blueprints. It was held together by shadows and silence. And buried beneath its polished marble floors was a truth that would unravel everything. And it all started with that notebook in my drawer, the one that still smelled faintly of my grandfather's cologne, the one I wasn't supposed to have, the one Father didn't even know existed. That was the year I stopped hoping to be seen. That was the year I started watching, planning, remembering. And that was the beginning of everything. By the time I turned 15, I had already learned to swallow disappointment like medicine, bitter, inevitable, and too familiar to resist. It coated my tongue with the heavy taste of silence, the kind that settles in your bones and makes you second-guess even your triumphs. In our house, victory was never celebrated unless it belonged to Theo, and even when it did, the applause always felt like a performance, hollow, rehearsed, and just loud enough to drown out the sound of my own accomplishments going unrecognized. That summer, I received a letter that would change everything, or so I thought. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between utility bills and sleek brochures from private golf clubs my father would never join but liked to have sent, just so he could throw them away with a smirk. The envelope was plain, white, but the logo on the top left corner made my pulse skip. The seal of Sterling Polytechnic, one of the most prestigious engineering universities in the country. Not just known for its curriculum, but revered for its lineage of inventors, thinkers, architects of the future. People who didn't just build structures, they built legacies. I opened the letter in the garage, sitting cross-legged between coils of wire and spare hydraulic parts. My hands shook not from fear, but from the electric knowledge that this was something I had earned. Not given. Not inherited. Not handed to me in a boardroom dressed as a photo op. I had studied under blankets, memorized algorithms on the back of soup can labels, coded entire simulations on a hand-me-down laptop that crashed every other hour, and somehow that relentless grind had worked. I'd been offered a full scholarship. I held the paper to my chest and smiled. Not the kind of smile you give to a camera, but the kind that breaks through years of trying not to care too much. I told myself I wouldn't cry, not over this, not here, not where I'd spent hours building things no one ever cared to see. But then the door opened, and my father's voice sliced through the quiet like it always did, not curious, but already disapproving. "What are you doing in here with the lights on? That meter's not going to pay itself." I stood slowly, tucking the letter behind my back, a reflex I didn't question. "I got accepted," I said finally, my voice calm but tight. "Sterling Polytechnic. Full ride. They want me." He looked at me like I'd just announced I was running off to join the circus. His jaw didn't drop. His eyes didn't light up. He didn't smile. He simply scoffed, a soft, dismissive sound that cracked like a whip. "So you're really chasing this nonsense then?" My heart sank before I even knew what that meant. "What nonsense?" "This fantasy that you're going to change the world with equations and ideas," he said, stepping further into the room, his boots echoing on the concrete. "You think you'll be respected? You think you'll be taken seriously on a construction site? You think those men are going to look at you, a girl in boots, and listen?" His words didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how familiar they felt, as if I'd been rehearsing for this conversation since I first picked up a wrench. "You don't get it," I said, voice steady. "It's not about them. It's about building something that matters." He smiled, a cruel, cold twist of his lips. "That's not your job. That's your brother's." "Theo." "Of course. Always Theo." Theo, who barely passed chemistry but was given his own office at Halden Engineering before he could legally drink. Theo, who got press photos with a hard hat and blueprint he didn't understand. Theo, who had once told me that working weekends was for people who can't delegate. And me, the one who built working prototypes in the basement while everyone else slept. I wasn't given a seat at the table. I had to build one from scratch. The next 4 years were the hardest I had ever known, not because Sterling Polytechnic was brutal, though it was, or because I lived off ramen and caffeine, though I did, but because I carried a weight no one else did. Every time I succeeded, I heard my father's voice in the back of my head, calling it luck. Every time I failed, it echoed louder, calling it proof. Despite the voices, I excelled. I graduated top of my class. I spoke at conferences before I was 21. I developed a pitch for a sustainable materials startup, a new kind of composite made from construction waste, cheaper and stronger than concrete. A future built from the failures of the past. Investors leaned in. Professors whispered about patents. I felt, for the first time, that maybe I was stepping out of my family's long, overbearing shadow. I named the startup Arca. Greek for arch, the most elegant solution to weight and pressure. And then it collapsed. It didn't fall apart because of bad numbers or poor planning. It didn't crash because I lacked vision or direction. It collapsed because of Victor Halden. He found out through one of his business associates, someone he golfed with, someone whose cousin sat on one of the early investor boards. He made a few calls, held a few polite conversations, pulled strings I didn't know he still had access to. And in under 72 hours, every family-connected investor pulled their funds. The rest followed like dominoes. I got the email at 4:17 a.m. My co-founder had sent it with the subject line, "You need to see this." And there it was, the truth spelled out in cold, formal language. The Halden name had cast too long a shadow over the venture, and not in the way I had hoped. No one wanted a scandal. No one wanted a feud. They wanted distance, and they got it by abandoning me. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply shut my laptop, walked to the bathroom, and vomited until my knees gave out. The next few weeks passed in a haze of numbness I didn't recognize. Depression, they said. Burnout. The elegant names for what happens when your purpose is dismantled by someone who was supposed to protect it. I stopped returning calls. I stopped eating. I stopped answering the door. And then, one night, as I sat in my tiny apartment with the lights off and my inbox full of condolences and regrets, I heard the knock. Not a loud one, gentle, rhythmic, familiar. It was my mother. She stepped inside quietly, carrying a small box. Her eyes, always so tired, always so quiet, searched my face like she hadn't seen it in years. She didn't speak right away. Just set the box on the table and sat across from me. "I saw the news," she said softly. "I heard what your father did." I didn't respond. She opened the box. Inside was a checkbook, a battered bank ledger, and a small envelope. She pushed it toward me. "This is everything I've saved," she whispered. "For years. For you." I stared at her, not understanding. "I've watched him dim your light since you were a child," she continued. "I didn't stop him. I didn't know how. But I won't be quiet anymore." I opened the envelope. There were bank statements, wiring instructions, and a note in her handwriting. "You don't need their money. You need your own." I wept for the first time in months, not from pain, but from the strange ache of being seen. Her support helped me back to my feet. Not all at once, but slowly, deliberately. I applied for jobs. I networked. I clawed my way back. And then the offer came, sleek, polished, and impossible to ignore. Krauss Engineering. The very rival my grandfather had spent the last decade of his life fighting in court over patent theft and ethics violations. The company that had tried, and failed, to absorb Halden Engineering during the recession. A name that meant betrayal in our household, spoken only in curses. They wanted me, not for a token role, but to lead a new innovation team. They saw what Arca could have been and wanted to build something better under my name. With their resources, I sat on the edge of my bed holding the offer letter, feeling the weight of 1,000 questions press against my lungs. Taking it meant turning my back on the name I had once worshipped. Accepting it meant acknowledging that blood did not always mean loyalty. That sometimes, family was the chain, not the anchor. But it also meant freedom. It meant building something without having to ask permission. It meant becoming someone on my own terms. I didn't call my father to ask his opinion. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I simply signed the offer and emailed it back. I had fought my way out of the shadow of an empire built on silence and steel, and now I was ready to build one of my own. I had spent the better part of my adult life learning how to enter a room like I belonged there, shoulders back, chin leveled just slightly higher than comfort allowed, and silence honed to the kind of stillness that made people second-guess your power. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the way I felt when I stepped through the towering double doors of the Halden Centennial Gala. That night, that shimmering, perfumed, over-orchestrated celebration of everything my family had built, smelled like polished betrayal long before the first flute of champagne reached my hand. The ballroom gleamed under chandeliers so massive they could have passed for art installations. Gold leaf curled across the ceiling like ivy choking the walls of a cathedral. The air buzzed with laughter too sharp to be genuine, and the clink of crystal glasses raised to toast a legacy that had always included me in name, but never in spirit. I hadn't been invited so much as tolerated, a gesture of etiquette, a politeness draped in velvet gloves and polished smiles, the kind that left fingerprints shaped like bruises. I had been away for 7 years. Not hiding, no, never that, but building something away from the reach of my father's voice, away from the cold applause of rooms like this. Yet when the envelope came, crisp, embossed, my name spelled perfectly as if they'd ever used it with reverence, I felt that old tug of curiosity. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was foolishness. Maybe I just wanted to see if the house of cards would collapse under its own weight. The moment I stepped inside, the chill hit me before the air conditioning could. Eyes slid past me like water on oiled glass. The kind of looking that wasn't quite ignoring, but worse, acknowledgement laced with erasure, like I was both visible and irrelevant at once. I recognized the tilt of their heads, the way their lips curled into social smirks designed to avoid real emotion. I had grown up studying these movements like a language, one I'd never been fluent in, but always understood fluently enough to know when it was being weaponized. I saw Theo before he saw me. He stood under a garlanded arch, center stage, basking in attention he hadn't earned. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his smile timed to land in the middle of laughter he hadn't created. People orbited him like he was a celestial body, gravity handed down through inheritance. When he caught my eye, something flickered, not surprise, not warmth, but the tight recognition of a chess player seeing a rival on the edge of the board. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He didn't even move. That told me everything. I found a table near the back, the kind they reserve for distant relatives and business partners who bring donations instead of history. My name was written on a name card, so pristine I almost laughed. No title. No mention of my company, my work, or the fact that just last quarter, the firm I led had been awarded a global contract to retrofit over 200 public buildings with the very green composites I'd developed. None of that mattered here. Here, I was still the daughter who left. The program ran like a well-oiled machine. Speeches flooded the stage, each more effusive than the last. Executives praised the Halden legacy like it was scripture. Video montages played across massive LED walls, showcasing a century of concrete, metal, and masculine achievement. And in every photo, every snippet, every archival reel, I was nowhere. Erased with surgical precision. Until the final segment began. A single spotlight cut through the dark. Victor Halden walked onto the stage like a monarch returning from exile. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, and his expression carried the unshakable calm of a man who believed the room belonged to him, because for decades, it had. The applause swelled. My fingers curled around the envelope in my lap, the one I'd been carrying all night without fully knowing why. "Tonight," he said, his voice sharp and smooth like chilled whiskey, "we honor not just the past, but the future." The crowd murmured their approval, the kind that sounds like sincerity if you squint. For 100 years, this company has been built by men of integrity, vision, and leadership, he continued. Men who understood what it meant to carry a name. I knew what was coming. I felt it before the air shifted. "Tonight," he said, turning with grand finality toward Theo, "I pass the torch to the next generation." The spotlight moved. It landed on Theo with surgical precision. The crowd turned. The applause built like thunder. Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a set of keys, old ones, ornate, ceremonial. The kind that didn't open anything practical, but symbolized the thing we had all been fighting over our entire lives. "I give this legacy to my son," he said, holding the keys out, "Theo Halden, the true heir to this company." The applause exploded. And then the knife. "And as for my daughter," Victor added, his voice dropping just enough to be heard clearly through the silence that immediately followed, "she has chosen her own path. A path that, though loud, has brought only embarrassment. Therefore, let me be clear." He turned, looked directly into the dark where I sat, and smiled like a guillotine. "She is no longer a representative of this family, nor this company. I hereby revoke any prior claims or associations." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock, it was the silence of agreement. Polished socialites blinked behind crystal glasses, their expressions unreadable and rehearsed. Some looked away. Some nodded faintly. And some, the worst of them, smiled. I couldn't move. My fingers trembled. The envelope crinkled in my lap. I had carried it for years, unopened, untouched, waiting for the moment that felt right. It was from my grandfather. Sealed the week before his death. Handwritten. No one knew I had it, not even my mother. It had been delivered by a courier, not long after I left the family company for good. I hadn't opened it then. I told myself I didn't need closure. But maybe I just wasn't ready for the kind of truth you can't walk back from. I broke the seal with hands that shook too much to be dignified. The paper inside was heavy, cream-colored, and smelled faintly of smoke and sawdust, my grandfather's scent. The words were written in his slanted, elegant handwriting, every stroke deliberate. It read, "My dearest, if you're reading this, it means the world didn't change fast enough, and the men in charge clung too tightly to the past. But I see you. I have always seen you. They gave Theo the empire, but I gave you something far more valuable. 10 years ago, you sketched a new material in the back of that notebook I gave you. You called it Bond. I took it. I tested it. And I patented it in your name. I filed it under a trust. You own the rights. Not the company. Not Theo. You. They don't know. I made sure they never would, unless they forced your hand. If they've done that, then go build something better. Burn nothing, but leave ashes they can't explain. With pride forever. Gee. I stared at the letter, unable to breathe. Bond. It had been a dream. A child's idea. A joke between me and a version of myself that once believed in alchemy. And he'd taken it. Protected it. Believed in it before I believed in myself. Suddenly, the clapping didn't matter. The stage, the spotlight, the ceremony, none of it mattered. I stood. People turned. Whispers rippled like cracks in glass. I didn't care. I walked out of that ballroom with the letter in my hand, my shoulders straight, my heart cracked open and catching fire. Let them have their throne. I had the future in my pocket. There's a different kind of silence that comes after humiliation, not the silence of shame, but the silence of clarity, of fire hardening into steel. When I walked out of that ballroom with my grandfather's letter in my hand and 1,000 unreadable stares at my back, something in me didn't just close. It transformed. The part of me that had spent 3 decades chasing recognition, craving legitimacy in the eyes of people who had never once considered me enough, that part of me died quietly on the steps of the Halden Gala. And in its place, something cleaner began to take root. I didn't start a new company for revenge. Let's be clear about that. This wasn't about proving Victor wrong, though, God knows, the satisfaction of watching his empire rust from a distance carried its own dark poetry. No, what I built came from somewhere deeper. From that aching place inside me that remembered being 10 years old, watching floodwaters rise in the valley and thinking, someone should fix that. From the girl who believed blueprints could be spells and that concrete could be molded into protection, not just profit. So, I started with nothing but a basement office, a rusted second-hand 3D printer, and the Bond patent rights transferred officially under my name. The company was called Rootline, no surname, no family crest, no legacy but what we were going to create from the soil up. We focused on climate-resilient housing, beginning in places where legacy had never reached. Rural counties decimated by wildfires. Coastal towns abandoned after hurricanes. Marginalized communities still living in trailers 2 decades after storms that stole everything but their names. We weren't there to cut ribbons. We were there to rebuild foundations, real ones, literal ones, made from the Bond composites I had dreamed up with crayons and later refined with polymer sciences and sleepless nights. And people noticed. Not because I paid PR firms to write glowing articles, but because we built homes where no one else even showed up with tarps. Journalists came curious and left astonished. They wrote about the woman who had walked away from a billion-dollar legacy and built houses that could withstand fire, wind, flood, and bureaucracy. They compared me to Theo without asking me to comment. I didn't need to. The contrast was writing itself. Meanwhile, the Halden name began to rot beneath the glossy surface. Theo, always charming, always eager to please, found himself drowning in obligations no one had prepared him for. Investors grew impatient. Projects stalled. Rumors of mismanagement swirled like vultures. The press, once eager to photograph his perfectly rehearsed smile, began asking harder questions. About missed sustainability targets. About layoffs. About the boardroom silence on climate responsibility when the world was literally burning. I ignored the calls at first. He left messages, at first cautious and corporate, hey, just checking in, would love to reconnect, the kind that carried too many lawyers behind them. Then, slowly, they grew honest. Desperate, even. I don't know what I'm doing, he said in one message I played twice but never responded to. They said I'd be ready, but no one ever told me how to lead. Then came the letter, handwritten, no envelope. Slid under the locked door of my small studio headquarters one quiet Monday morning. He didn't ask me to come back. He asked me for help. Not as a Halden, not as a sister, but as someone who had done what he hadn't, built something real, something resilient, something alive. I sat with that letter for hours, the corners softening under my thumbs, the weight of everything we'd been, and everything we hadn't, settling over me like dust on blueprints. I wanted to call him. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to hug him and sob into his shoulder and beg him to remember the kid who used to steal my cookies and then cry if I didn't pretend to forgive him. But instead, I did what I had trained myself to do since childhood. I worked. I poured the ache into new sketches, new builds, new pilot programs for modular eco-housing on tribal land. I flew to Nebraska to help install cooling systems in drought-proof shelters built for families still displaced from the last tornado season. I stayed moving, always moving. And then, the call came. It was dusk, and I was on the edge of a community lot in New Mexico, watching volunteers teach kids how to use hammers. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. My body tensed. Theo's voice was on the other end, soft, cracking. She's gone. My knees buckled before I even knew who he meant. Mom. The woman who had once placed a checkbook into my lap with shaking hands and told me she believed in me when no one else would. The woman who had spoken in whispers her entire life, but found her voice when I needed it most. I don't remember much of the flight, just the cold hum of the plane and the weight of that grief pressing into my ribs like scaffolding collapsing inward. The funeral was quiet, tasteful, and unbearable. Polished wood. White roses. People who hadn't spoken to her in a decade, suddenly wearing grief like jewelry. I stood beside Theo at the cemetery and felt the distance between us shrink into something intimate and ancient. He didn't speak until the last mourner left. I need to show you something, he said, his voice brittle, his eyes rimmed red. We drove in silence to the house. The same house where we'd grown up, where legacy had been measured in expectations and withheld praise. He led me into our mother's room, untouched, reverent. From a drawer beneath the dresser, he pulled a sealed envelope. It was addressed to me. From our grandfather. Again. Theo didn't speak. He handed it to me and sat on the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet like it held answers. The letter was short. If you're reading this, it means the game has ended and the stage has cleared. They gave him the name, but I gave you the blueprint. You're not my heir because you are my blood. You're my heir because you understood what it meant to build, not inherit. Whatever they say, whatever they take, remember, the Real Foundation was never made of concrete. It was made of conviction. I couldn't breathe. When I looked up, Theo was crying openly. I didn't know, he whispered, about any of it. He told me I was the chosen one. He told me that you were too rebellious, too reckless. He said I had to clean up after your mess. He made me believe it. I sat beside him, our shoulders brushing for the first time in years. He manipulated both of us. He nodded slowly. I don't want the company. I never did. But I didn't know how to not want it. Not with him watching. We sat there for a long time. Two grown children mourning a mother who died trying to hold us both together, and a grandfather who had understood us more than we had ever understood ourselves. The next day, at the memorial fundraiser, I spoke. I stood before a crowd of people who had once clapped for my erasure, and now waited to see what I'd say. I didn't talk about the company. I didn't talk about betrayal. I talked about roots. About how buildings, like people, need the right soil, not just money or names or blueprints. They need room to grow crooked before they grow strong. They need weathering. They need time. I forgave Theo. Publicly. Deliberately. But when the press asked if I would return, if I would take the reins now that the truth had come out, I shook my head. No, I said, smiling. I don't want to preserve a legacy built to exclude people like me. I want to build new ones that include everyone. I left the room lighter than I had ever felt before. I had risen without the name, and I had no intention of ever going back. When I was a child, I believed legacy was something carved into stone, a monolith passed from father to son, etched in concrete and contracts, impermeable to dissent, immune to change. I believed that to inherit meant to accept, that to belong meant to obey, and that any deviation from the blueprint was a betrayal. But belief, like concrete, cracks under pressure. And once fractured, the light gets in. By the time I reached my late 30s, I had stopped measuring myself by their yardsticks. I no longer waited for recognition from marble halls or oak-paneled boardrooms echoing with dead men's ambitions. My company, Root Line, had become something real, not just a business, but a living, breathing ecosystem. We didn't just build structures, we built futures. We became a model, studied in universities, replicated in disaster-prone countries, embraced by governments finally ready to listen to the architects who came from the margins. They asked me to speak in places that once laughed at the idea of a woman in work boots. I lectured at institutions that had rejected my mother's generation and barely tolerated mine. I sat on panels beside men who had once dismissed me, and I watched their discomfort grow as the applause lingered long after I'd spoken. Not because I was provocative. Not because I was brilliant. But because I was right. Because I had done the work they pretended to understand. We had redefined housing in flood zones. We had re-engineered shelters for wildfire corridors. We had proved that sustainability was not a luxury, but a necessity, and that dignity, not survival, should be the baseline for rebuilding. My team, a kaleidoscope of minds, voices, and names, had grown from 6 unpaid interns in a converted storage unit to over 300 full-time engineers, builders, sociologists, and local hires across 5 continents. We didn't build mansions. We built schools, clinics, resilient homes with solar cores and water recycling systems that made deserts feel like possibilities again. People stopped asking about the Halden name. And when they did, I just smiled. Because I hadn't needed to reclaim it. I had outgrown it. Then, one day, almost a decade after the gala, after the funeral, after Theo's letter and the choice I made not to return, an invitation arrived. An interview. They were doing a documentary, a legacy piece on climate innovators who had changed the world. They wanted to film me walking through the old Halden engineering headquarters. The building had become a historical landmark, they said. A shell of what it was purchased, gutted, and partially preserved like a tomb that smelled faintly of ambition and dust. I said yes. Not because I owed them anything, but because I knew what it would mean to walk those halls, not as a ghost, but as a storm. The day I arrived, the air was strangely still. The receptionist, young and unfamiliar with the bloodlines that once controlled the very soil we stood on, offered me water with a nervous smile. I walked slowly through the corridors, flanked by the film crew. The cameras rolled. The director whispered cues. But I barely heard them. The walls echoed differently now, no longer loud with judgment, but soft with the absence of power. Then I saw him. My father. Victor Halden. The man who once disinherited me with a smile in front of 500 strangers and a dozen cameras now sat in a wheelchair by the window of the old conference room. Frail. Silent. Eyes sunken. Hands twitching slightly in his lap like he still wanted to hold control, but the muscle memory had betrayed him. He didn't speak as I entered. Neither did I. We stared at each other for what felt like 100 years. Then he blinked. Once. Slowly, I pulled up a chair across from him, careful not to disturb the silence. I waited. Not out of respect. Not out of fear. But out of the understanding that some battles end not with explosions, but with breath. Finally, he spoke. You did it, he said, voice rasping like wine through dry grass. Without us. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window behind him, the same view I used to stare at as a child, dreaming of cities that made room for people like me. I didn't do it without you, I said. I did it because of you. His brow furrowed. Not in gratitude, I clarified, but in defiance. You showed me what a legacy looks like when it's built on fear and exclusion. And I chose to build something else. He swallowed hard. I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp. You tried to build with walls. I chose bridges. He looked away. I don't know if he cried. I don't know if he could. But I left him there, staring out at a world he no longer recognized, built by a daughter he once refused to see. A month later, I returned to the site of my grandfather's first project. A simple, beautiful bridge built by hand in the foothills outside a small, now forgotten town. It had collapsed years ago, swallowed by erosion and time. What remained was a cracked foundation, some rusted beams, and the stories people told when they passed by. I bought the land. I brought in my team. We didn't rebuild the bridge. We built something better. A community center. Solar-powered. Flood-proof. Fire-resistant. Open to all. We called it the Halden Archive, not for Victor, but for Gerald, and for the girl he once believed in before anyone else did. My name was on the front, not as an author of vengeance, but as a signature of reclamation. Inside, we displayed blueprints of all our projects, side by side with stories from the people we'd built for. Testimonials. Artwork. Photographs. The materials we used. The failures we endured. The resilience we celebrated. It became a place not to worship the past, but to ignite the future. And when the ribbon was cut, I didn't give a long speech. I just looked at the crowd, a patchwork of lives and legacies, and said, "They removed my name from the will." I paused, then smiled. I gave it to the world instead. And they clapped. Not out of obligation. Not out of politeness. But because they understood. Because they saw. Because they belonged. And this time, so did I.